Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We've got a fantastic turnout, so I'm really excited to get started. My name is Jeff Model. I'm the founder of CG Architects, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we begin, though, I want to introduce our speaker today, Joseph Kim, and I'm going to go over a little bit of the format of the webinar today, too. So Joseph is an architectural designer and technology enthusiast who works as a project manager at MJM Architects out of Nashville, Tennessee. Some of you may even know him from his popular YouTube channel under his own name, where he covers architectural technologies, including software tutorials, hardware reviews, and AEC industry events. And I'll post a link to that in the chat in a few minutes. So before we begin, we're going to launch some polls because we want to get a better idea of who's attending today. So I'm going to launch the first poll here. And while we do that, I'm going to transfer over to Joseph in just a second here. But throughout the webinar today, actually, let me launch the poll. There we go. Throughout the webinar today, if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the question and answer box. And we'll try to make this as interactive as possible, but we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Joseph, there on the polls.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. I see the polls going up, and that's great. So yeah, I just wanted to ask to understand the audience today. So the first poll question was, how well do you know Enscape? And the first one is, I don't know anything, and that's exactly the reason why you guys are here. And the second is beginner, intermediate, expert, and hopefully we'll be able to see some ninjas. We can close poll. I guess we've got.
Okay, I'll share the results here. There we go.
Yeah, so we've got 44% of intermediate. So I assume people are going to know Enscape a bit coming in. So perhaps tips and tricks would be more adequate. All right, I'm moving on to the next one.
All right.
So which of the following best describes your role? And first one is architect, and then CGI artist or visualizer as a second option. The third is an interior designer, landscape designer, or any other designer type, or any other people participating in similar industry could choose the other. And I had expected a bit more CGI artists, but it's good to see fellow architect, designer type of people.
All right, we got most of the people voted here, so I'm going to close the poll and show the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good number there with the architectural role.
Right, and our last poll question
is, what is your primary 3D modeling software? This is modeling software, not the rendering software. Okay, good, good. So I'm seeing Sketchup and Revit mostly, a lot on Revit side, and very few Rhino and 3D Max.
It's actually
yeah.
All right, I'm going to close. We got almost everybody voted, so I'm going to close this poll and share those results.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah, good to see those two numbers because we are going to talk about those two, SketchUp and Revit. So, all right, with that out of the way, I'll just read over our title and the very reason we are here today. I'll cover how to maximize your use of architectural visualization to impress the clients. And these are the certain topics that we're going to cover in this webinar. Real-time rendering, concept to VR, focus on your project, model organization or management as well, and then Enscape Toolkit and extra tips. I'll stop sharing my webcam just so we can cover higher bandwidth throughput. So first thing that I do want to cover is what the impress the clients means. And we're going to define the client, but if you're an architect, the client is your owner or the project owner. And if you're CGI artist, then the client may be the architect or the owner as well. So we need to target those two set of people, and then how to impress them. And impress meaning bringing more value to your project or to the table of what you offer as a service. So perhaps there's two ways to do that. One is you offer sort of the same product or service, but in less time or the effort that you spent on, or just overall cost. And then the second way is to bringing more extra service or product with the same time and effort and cost. So with the GPU improvements and the technology improvements, now we're seeing more real-time rendering. And you guys seen as a, I've seen the poll as a more intermediate user, so I assume you guys know what real-time rendering is. But progressive rendering and cloud rendering and AI denoising was possible before. And we're going to look at real-time rendering today. And it is no longer time consuming and no need to have a lot of effort, and it's not a costly process and therefore more value. So here's a little animation that I want to play. So it might be a little bit choppy there, but I want to understand what you guys are seeing there. So hopefully you guys start to understand not just the picture, overall picture of the space, but also sort of the movement and scale of your project. And if you're able to change stuff on your model, then you start to understand the project. So let me just quit the share here. And this is actual model here. So I'm actually driving this and able to go inside. And let me pull away from the Enscape side and then move on to the actual 3D modeling software. In this case, it's actually SketchUp.
Hey, Joseph, there's a question here about what GPU you're running.
Go ahead.
There was a question about which GPU you were running.
Oh, I'm actually using NVIDIA RTX 2080 Super at the moment. And I understand a bit of a choppiness in terms of frame rate here, but I promise it's actually quite buttery smooth on my screen. So what you are just seeing is this model inside of SketchUp here. So you can see it's sort of more of a simpler format inside of SketchUp, yet it gets all rendered up inside of Enscape. So just to show both of the screens at the same time, I'm going to snap one side to as a SketchUp on the left and then Enscape on the right side. Then I'm able to either move out or just synchronize the view like that. And this becomes incredibly useful because you can actually have the Enscape screen shown on your presentation screen. Let's say you're sitting inside of the presentation room, or if you're doing a presentation, then you just maximize the Enscape side window on your shared screen side. And then you can have SketchUp shown on your side so that you can just kind of navigate through your SketchUp model, yet you're able to see Enscape on the presentation where your client will be viewing. So it becomes not only just an image, you're able to just do this live presentation as I am doing this live webinar format. So I mentioned about changing something on your projects. For example, we can talk about how many vegetation or planters that we can have inside of your model. So we can go ahead and increase the amount, and everything will be changing on your presentation side. And just to demonstrate, let me go ahead and change the cladding on the building here. So as I just apply that material, everything is immediate. Therefore, you start to talk about, okay, what would you like on your project? What kind of material? What's the size of the door, size of the opening? What kind of lighting would you prefer? We can have that design discussion, and hopefully the amount of architectural role people here would be able to appreciate this sort of design communication method that we have with Enscape. So changing stuff inside of your model not only allows you to understand your project better, but also you just start to connect together. So your client, your project, yourself kind of become more emotionally connect. And it's so much better than just saying, okay, I have some ideas. Let me get back to you in an email in a couple of days. I think having that discussion is really, really important. So let me go back to the presentation. So the next one that I want to cover is concepts to VR. So this is the idea where you start to cover everything from the beginning of the project till the very end. And I just kind of snuck in the VR at the very end. So this is covering everything from programming to schematic design, and then design development to construction drawing and construction admin, and then just a very visualistic type of presentation of VR. And VR could really happen anywhere during that process, but we want to implement rendering process from very early on of a project. So here is sort of a diagrammatic type of render. Obviously, I understand a lot of people are doing this already, but just we are looking at the site and then start to do messing and some openings or glazing, how we're going to fit into. And notice, we taken out all the material, override all the material so that it's shown as sort of the white mode, the clay render. And this is actually part of Revit. I was just trying to do a storefront study, and then the rendering accompanied by the drawings is really powerful because you start to understand the actual scale, but also what it does in terms of 3D view. Some of your clients may just not understand everything in drawing. If you showed just the plan, they don't really understand how the storefront is supposed to work. Obviously, you're not showing much, but you're able to have that conversation of what the material is going to be, how big the storefront is going to be, what the glazing is going to impact in terms of size. Some of the things that are not as apparent will start to show up as you have 3D renderings or the sort of 3D perspective or orthographic type of view. So you should use those together. So also with the rendering, you start to produce sort of the mood board of the project. So you typically lay out certain type of materials, and then you do hand sketches, you talk about the plan, and then you start to put together how those materials really work for your project. And then instead of just relying on the mood board, the physical mood board, you can start to apply all of that to your project and then show it to your client how those materials really play together. So again, show some drawings, architectural drawings, to show them what the layout is like and how the materials are playing together inside of your project. And because all of those is just immediate, it becomes really, really powerful. You can start to change certain aspects of the project. So replace the brick to something else, or just change the tone of the brick, and then discuss whether that's going to work together or not. And so you can really utilize the real-time rendering that it brings onto the table. So you can modify overall look and feel. This is just an example of interior shot that you can get out of Enscape, and obviously you can just kind of decorate a bit with some ideas, but you can talk about certain materials and how they play together inside of interior as well. So let me also mention all of this, because they're all done inside of Enscape. You can invite your clients to wear VR headset and then be able to walk around those spaces as well. And it is most beneficial in a space where you start to understand the scale and how the spatial quality is understood to your clients. So something like an exterior shot like this, you may not experience as much, but when you start to jump into an interior, it could be a kitchen, it could be a really big commercial spaces of atrium or retail spaces, you can start to walk around and really understand how high the roof is, or how high the ceiling is, and how big the openings are. And those really come to life as you wear your VR headset and literally walk around your project that is not built yet. And another side is the fact that you can change your stuff inside of the project whilst the client is wearing the headset. So you can really put those design communication put forward. Okay, so the next one that I want to talk about is non-destructive workflow. And because I kind of made this term up, it may or may not be so well understood by you. But the idea is not to stop designing or interrupt the designing process. So I don't know how many in this webinar understand what we are looking at here. It may look a bit gloomy, dark. I don't know if this kind of makes sense to you, but ones who's sort of experienced in this rendering neighborhood, then you may notice these boxes are the silhouettes, or the wire boxes meant the proxies of certain type of objects inside a view. And then you may realize these sort of colored faces means certain material IDs. And this has been sort of the typical process, how we process the materials inside of the project for post-processing, or just kind of reduce amount of resource that's used by the 3D modeling software or the CAD. So I really want to avoid this process. It's because if you start to introduce this sort of workflow into your project, your design workflow really becomes somewhat destructive. And that's why I'm using that non-destructive workflow. So my workflow is to avoid this sort of the objects that are being used. So we're trying to get this sort of scene, and somehow we could end up something like this if you were to use other type of render or other type of process. So obviously the trees are replaced by the boxes that you are seeing, and certain type of materials that has been applied to your house here or your project here had received very colorful, in this case, a red roof, for example. So we want to really avoid those sort of things. So this is the exterior shot. And then this is what I would like to see inside of the SketchUp side. So trees are still represented as a blob of object that somewhat looks like tree. And then all the materials are still visible as what they are supposed to look like. I guess it is more rendered up, or more visualistically appealing. and it is a bit more realistic with the soft shadows and all of those amazing things that the Enscape rendering engine does. But I still want to see the simplified form inside of SketchUp. And why do I say that? It might be because you're working for a multi-people firm where multiple people are working inside of the same file. And if you start to see something like this, they may or may not realize they have deleted something that doesn't make sense inside of your model. And you may or may not realize that certain type of material that you have applied may be colliding with what they're intending to do. Obviously, they didn't want a red roof on this project, so you want to show it in the way that it's intended. So this is the interior view, and this is what I wanted in terms of the visual, but you may end up with a model that looks something like this, where you start to have a weird blob that floats in the middle of the space, and then certain light cones that are showing, or a certain type of people. You can kind of recognize this as a person, but sometimes seeing a blob is not necessarily the best thing that you want to see inside of your model. So let me go ahead and show you actually what I'm talking about inside here. So the little tip that I want to suggest is when you start to use asset library inside of Enscape, let me pull up the asset library here. So if I go to vegetation and then put down any sort of tree here, you'll notice that they kind of come in as a white blob, and you can kind of see that it is a tree even if you weren't seeing this rendered up version on the right. But still, it is more helpful to have the green and the brown stem or the trunk of the tree. So my tip here is to actually apply green onto the foliage on top, triple click, and then just apply that color here, and then also sample the brown trunk or the stem color, and then again sort of triple click to apply that, or I can actually just apply it to the outside. That way it just sort of receives there. So that way it is more representative of what the tree is supposed to be, instead of having a white blob. That way everyone starts to understand this is a simpler form of tree. It doesn't take as much resource on your view, yet it renders up really well inside of the Enscape side. So hopefully, you're utilizing much less sort of those wired boxes, the proxy elements, and then materials that are more representative of what you're supposed to see inside of your render. That way, it is not destructive. Another thing that I want to avoid as I work up my design is to saving out any sort of copy of file, or saving out any sort of unique scene inside of your file. As you do that, you break away from your existing model to a rendering model, and then you're starting to manage two different models for your renderings. And that was sort of known workflow, or it used to be the workflow that you typically do as you work up your visualization or rendering process. But we're starting to use rendering as a design tool, and we want to avoid that so that we don't waste our resource or time trying to doing that. So the overall goal is to make the CAD software, the 3D modeling software, as more simplified version, yet Enscape is sort of the enhanced view modeling, or sorry, it's more of an enhanced view mode that you can see. And the render really needs to complement the design process, not really get in the way. So let me move on to the presentation slides back here. So the next sort of advice that I want to give is to focus on your project. So this kind of goes hand in hand with non-destructive workflow, but removing distractions. So obviously we want to work on composition that shows the story. What are we trying to show inside of your view? Obviously you want to kind of center the things that you want to show in the middle of the image or the screen, and then focus on certain type of material, the geometry, your architecture, the space that you're designing. So here I've taken out material completely. We all understand this as either clay render, white render, I guess material overridden view if you come from the other side. So sometimes I find materiality could be quite distracting. I don't want to discuss yet about the tone of the wood and the actual patterning of the wood. I just want to sell the form and discuss about the architecture that we are designing, how it is sort of floating above and then attached to the vertical circulation that's on the left. So I want to utilize that sort of mode. So that is available in the Enscape side. So let me go ahead and break out to here. So under the visual settings, which is hidden at the moment. So visual settings, there's a button right there. And then I can click on that. And when this dialog shows up, let me snap this screen to the left again. I'm trying to wait for the screen share to catch up with me. So in here, as I have the view synchronized, I can just change the mode to the white. And this is more of the material overridden view. And everything that is either glass or water is still understood as glass or water, but everything else becomes white. That way you can start to talk about the form and the space instead of a specific material that is being shown inside of your visual. So that's what I like to utilize whenever I'm trying to present my project and their form. And let me go back to the slides. So here, let's try and spot the problem. What is your, what are your eyes most drawn into? And in my case, I would strongly argue the fact that you focus on this person's face. Unfortunately, we are all human and we're drawn to people's face. And when you have a person you can possibly recognize, you may not recognize, but you can possibly recognize the face, and all the faces are quite distracting to your design and project. And instead of recognizing what this interior space is, how the kitchen is lit, or natural light is coming from one side in this tiny little kitchen and living space, everyone is drawn to the person who's answering a phone in the middle of the space. And that's why I try to avoid recognizable or showing faces in the middle of the scene or on the foreground. And you want to place them in a way that you don't see their faces, or in a distance where it is not distracting. So in this one, because how small the project is, I would just go ahead and remove the person so that we don't see anything. In terms of understanding the scale, you may be able to put a person in different position or in a different way. I'll explain that later after a few slides. But from here, you can go further to take out the material and then just really discuss about the form and how small this space is and amount of lights that are coming in from the large openings that are on the right side. So you can really discuss those points and make your story across, your point across to your client as you do this. And as I mentioned, you can just put in the person in different way. So here, what I advise is you can put silhouettes of a person. I would actually put them to more in a way it doesn't occupy in the middle of the space, but for the sake of this presentation, I just put them in the middle, but silhouettes of people is really understood well, much better than 3D person who has faces. So I want to bring this to the table as I saw a lot of people using SketchUp and people who's used to using SketchUp and Enscape. So let me go ahead and show on here, and then the Enscape. So here I actually had put in some people into the model. So if I turn them on, you can see that I have put these silhouettes of people. And one of the great thing about Enscape is the fact that it understands these components that are coming from SketchUp side, and no other real-time engines that I have seen so far understand or interpret the face me components this way. So that's what they are called, face me components, and they are just the billboard type that we understand as a CGI artist point of view. And you can start to orient the project and they just never show the sign. So I advise using them as much as you can, just so that you can avoid distraction within your scene. And as you rotate, they just never show the sides of them. Okay. So in here, I have used 3D people in the scene, and I can kind of see her face here. So your eyes may be drawn to her, but she's still in the distance. So you start to, right after that, you'll start to recognize how the materials are playing inside of this kitchen, or how much of so many stuff is on top of a table. So you can still kind of build that story. People are working here on this corner of the table, and you can build that story into your renderings.
Joseph, there's a question here about the Face Me component, about whether or not it's strictly from SketchUp or whether it can work with Revit as well.
It's strictly from SketchUp side. It's one of the perks that you can benefit from. And yeah, unfortunately on Revit side, it is not possible. Was there any other question?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions that have come in here. I don't know if you want to take some of those now or if you want to wait till the end. They were kind of, more general questions, nothing specific to what you were presenting.
Yeah, sure. I can answer a few more. I want to stay a bit more engaged. I'm actually having trouble seeing the questions here as the dialogue is very
Sure, I can
small.
read those out to you. So there was actually a couple questions here about where you get your materials from.
I try to use as many native materials that are built into the software. So if it is on SketchUp side, I try to use as many native SketchUp materials, although they don't have a very good library. But I generally try to Google some and then just make image-based material into SketchUp. And once they look good, I just sort of revamp them to Enscape type of material so that we start to apply reflections and everything else. And I find myself using same material over and over just because I like them. So at that point, I try to save them as a library so that I can use them later again. On the Revit side, however, you have better sort of library that you can use on the Revit side. Again, I try to use as much native material as possible.
There's a question here about whether or not you've ever done any virtual staging in Enscape.
Virtual staging. No, I have not. But I have done a ton of VR presentation where it is, I feel, still pretty close to virtual staging.
Okay, another question here about whether you are using really large files using proxies to prevent the program from running slowly.
Yes, and that was, I guess, what I was trying to show with the blocky wireframe that was shown in the scene. There are some models that are really, really heavy, and the proxy is only used in SketchUp at the moment on the Enscape side. So I try to utilize that on SketchUp side mostly, but also there are other means to reduce the resource that the 3D models utilize in your modeling software. So I'll try to utilize those before jumping into proxies.
Okay. It goes back to an earlier question we had a few minutes ago about the GPU you're using here, but there was a question about whether or not you recommend the GeForce RTX or Quadro RTX, and are you using gaming or studio drivers?
Um, that is a very, very good question, and I want to be politically correct and also personally correct. Personally, politically, I suppose you can find all the answers online, but personally, I still recommend GeForce RTX over Quadro RTX. And that is only personally because the projects that I work on aren't as heavy where they're using a lot of VRAM. Therefore, I still can use GeForce RTX to handle most of my projects. And also Enscape is really optimized in the way that it doesn't take up as much of frame buffer. And I'm still using a gaming driver on my personal machine on the desktop, but at work in my office desk, I'm using studio drivers. I'm just trying to really distinguish what sort of quality difference I may or may not have at the moment. So I don't have much of a decision in that yet.
Okay. Yeah, we've still got tons of questions pouring in, so I don't know if you maybe want to carry on a little bit,
Okay,
and then we'll kind of
I'll
filter
carry on
through
a
some of
bit.
these.
Yeah, I'll carry on a bit and then I'll try to answer as much as I can after.
Sounds good.
Um, yeah, so model organization and management is what I want to kind of cover after all of those questions. But actually, this it covers about proxy a bit. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So obviously, this is tree heavy project, the example that I'm using. I'm avoiding using very complex project for live webinar. I don't want to crash my machine or have that much of a risk. But here is tree heavy project, and if all of those trees were all materialized inside of SketchUp, having all the leaves shown and all the edges shown, then it'll really start to bog down my model. So in terms of actual modeling part, what I like to do is to save a scene at the very top left as a very first scene inside of SketchUp as a modeling view. So on the modeling view, all the trees and entourages that I don't typically need are hidden. And this one tree is the one that I brought in during the webinar. So that's why this one is showing up. But as long as I get rid of that one, the first scene is sort of the modeling view. And then all the scenes that are following are the ones that are dedicated for a certain type of position or composition where I try to tell certain type of story. So that way you start to manage your model in a way that you can quickly see the rendering view, but at the same time model away. So as I go into the modeling view, everything was being done in the background, but if I go back to the Enscape view, notice how everything is switching back and forth. So aerial view, modeling view, you can just snap very quickly together. If I don't have this synchronized, then it won't follow me like that, but I try to go in between so that I can quickly model away certain things. So going back to the slide, I want to utilize that sort of switching on and off to keep things isolated. And obviously there was a usage of layers, or what they referred as tags inside of SketchUp. They just changed the naming from layers to tags. So I try to use that as much as I can. In terms of layering, I know someone's going to ask that question. In terms of layering, I have a bit more robust layering system or tagging system, but currently in this model, only people, cars, trees are being utilized. And I have another tag that's dedicated as Enscape lights for the light cones that I try to implement into the interior scene, so I can toggle them on and off very quickly. So in this case, I can just toggle off the cars or the trees. That way, everything goes away quickly. This is a presentation view. So there you go. And let me just snap back to the more normal view so that you guys see what I'm talking about. So just putting people back, cars, trees into the scene. So just try to utilize that as much as you can. And to bring the point across, I also have Revit Ready. So in here, if I want to hide all of the entourages or the assets that are coming from Enscape side, if I want to hide them quickly, I just go here, select one of those elements, and then I can either temporarily just hide them. So here I can go to hide category. And as I do that, it may take a moment. I'm wondering if, oh, this is a plan view, sorry. Same thing here, and then hide category. And as I do that, everything should go away in your Enscape scene. And then I can reset everything as I need them back into the scene. And I use this process also when I'm trying to see stuff inside of the building. So here I can highlight either the roof or ceiling, and then I can just hide the element. And this is just a temporary hide. If you wanna go back to all of this and then just hide it completely because you just don't need that tree altogether, then EH for short. And I can just hide that element altogether. And if I need to get it back, I can hit RH to reset hidden elements, reveal hidden elements. And then I can click that one and then reveal that element back. And then RH again to get out of this mode. So that way you can just quickly toggle certain type of things inside of your model if that is just bogging down amount of the resource that is being utilized. I do have to admit that some of the assets that come in on the Revit side may be triangulated heavy as this. So you may want to just kind of hide them altogether as a category inside of your plan versus you show them in your 3D view. So going back to the slide, so if you hadn't used that sort of softening of your trees and coloring your trees, your view will start to look like this, and then it really doesn't really make sense and start to take up your resources. And another point that I want to bring out here as I maximize my SketchUp scene here, if I go to File and Import, and then I can go to this folder here where I had saved out a tree. So I can import this tree into the scene. And this is more of a SketchUp 3D warehouse type of tree that you will find. And notice how it has leaves and everything, but I don't have any of the edges shown. And so that kind of allows SketchUp to easily handle. My computer is, I would say, still powerful, so it would be able to handle a single tree. But if this becomes hundreds of the same tree with all of the edges shown, that it would be more difficult to show and render up on your viewport. So if I start to show all the hidden edges like this, then I immediately start to notice a little bit of frame rate that is being dropped. I'm trying to see the audience view, see how much of a delay there is, but it becomes a bit more choppier, especially if I have a lot of these assets. So I would try to avoid edge heavy, and if you're starting to if you have imported an element that has a lot of edges shown like this, so I'm just trying to unhide all the edges so that all the edges are shown. You can really be slowing your machine down. If that's the case, you can just double click into those things and then double click to select the face and all the surrounding edges, and then deselect the face. And then from here, you can right click and then hide. And as those edges hide away, it becomes much easier for your computer to handle. And let me just put this to the side. And let me just show you what that looks like inside of Enscape. So let me synchronize the scene. So that tree still looks fine. It's just doesn't move like other Enscape trees. So that way it's not taking up as much resource, but still look okay in your scene. And I'm just using tree as an example, as it's typically very edge heavy, but any other objects like cars or specific type of equipment or furniture that you're trying to bring into the scene, you can apply the same method into your model. So here, obviously we covered coloring the trees for the assets that are coming in. I even apply a little bit of color to my car as well, as the wheels come in as white. I just kind of applied that color so that everyone understands or see the blob of the car. And then I will certainly turn off all the shadows inside of your SketchUp side, because obviously, Enscape handles shadows a lot better than you can inside of SketchUp. Therefore, I would certainly turn off all the shadows in your scene. I would not turn them on by default. And sometimes, as I mentioned, try to use proxies. And there are two ways to utilize proxies inside of SketchUp when you're using Enscape. One way is to have an element that comes in like this, and then right click it and then save as an external model for Enscape. And then I can just save that out to my desktop. And as I do that, it becomes that wire box that I was talking about earlier inside of your modeler, and becomes a tree, or actually better looking tree inside of Enscape side. And from here, just to stay true to non-destructive workflow, or continue with the shape that kind of makes sense into your view, I go in and double click. Let's say I just copy this tree and then double click into this component and paste it into the view. And I just triple click on this box so that I can get rid of it. And that way in your scene, it shows up as a blob of a tree. I can apply the same color. That way it just replaces it, and can either copy that or scale it differently so that it is somewhat randomized. All of that is possible. So that becomes your custom asset in a way. Another way is to go into your Enscape objects, and the window shows up like this. And then I can do the linked model. So I can link in a model that's outside of SketchUp, and then obviously it comes in as a box again. So you would have to do the same practice of replacing this geometry with meaningful geometry that replaces the simpler look. I'll go over other things on the slide here. So next one that I want to mention is Enscape Toolkit. And this is basically all the extra features that Enscape brings on board onto the table to either SketchUp or Revit, so that it helps your designing process, not as just a rendering engine, but it starts to build in some more features into the design workflow. The first one I want to mention is the BIM mode. So inside of especially on the Revit side, because it's BIM. Inside of here, I can actually go to hit B. So there's a little HUD that's usually built in, and right now it's in the ortho mode, so I'm gonna change that. So from orthographic to perspective. So from here, I can hit B once, and that goes into the BIM mode. And I need to show my taskbar. Yep, so BIM mode, I start to see all of these elements that are being used inside of your model. And as I highlight them, they just kind of highlight in the list as well. So I can select this one, walkway. And then they start to highlight what that walkway's material is. So you can immediately see what material that you are using for that specific element that is being shown, and becomes really useful because finding the material that is being used for your project inside of Revit is not as easy as it seems. So having this sort of list view that is showing up in your scene is really, really useful. So B for a BIM mode that is highlighted in the HUD that is shown here. And also collaboration modes, which is C. And collaboration mode is a recent feature that they have built in. And basically, you can start to have commenting system inside of your model. And then I can have certain comments or sort of the feedback so that your colleagues or your client can even highlight certain aspects and create an issue. And I can issue certain type of things. So let me go back here and try to save different view. So in here, I can go over to, let's say, something like this, and then say, oh, I need to see a sign here. So create issue, and then start to have rendered image into your specific issue that you have. And then here I can say, let's put sign. And then you can put down description. And that way, later on, you can see what they have left into your model, and then you can address those issues, and then you can delete them afterwards too. So the collaboration mode is not something built into Revit, but something that Enscape has put onto the Enscape Toolkit, if you may. So let me move on to the next scene here. And another one that I want to mention as a Enscape's sort of tool is the standalone. And there are two types of standalone available for Enscape. One is EXE, executable standalone. The other one is web or the browser standalone. And basically what it is that you can share either an EXE file to your client to just literally double click and then just walk around and do the walkthrough by themselves without holding a license or anything like that. So it's a great way to share your model to other either colleague or client. And another way is to do it through a browser. It has lesser fidelity, however, it is much easier to run. So you don't even have to share a file, you can just share a link on the web standalone, and that becomes really powerful way to share your design, and you can have them walk around themselves, and then you can talk about certain aspects inside of your project rather than showing just a slideshow. Yeah, so this is the example screen of this model being online. If you're a fast typer, you can probably type in this one and then go to that link, and then we'll be able to see this model online. Or you can also have an executable file that gets saved out, and then you can just share that to your client or colleague. So this brings to my last slide. As an extra tip, there are a few things that I want to mention. The top of the list is outline function. Anyone coming from CGI neighborhood would know what ambient occlusion is, and it kind of does that without being all technical. So my preference in the rendering, it's more of my style rather, but inside of the visual settings, I like to put a bit more outline in my scene. And that gives a good amount of definition to your faces of the objects. So let me go ahead and kind of zoom into a certain area. So here is most apparent if you're in a white view. So when there is sort of the fold of a face, for example, here, because of the outline, it becomes more defined. Therefore, you start to understand the geometry a lot better than you would without it. So if I were to reduce it, kind of becomes a bit more bland in all of those places. Not as much because you got some shadow, but especially in this place, the edges aren't as defined. Let's say the treads of the stairs is not as apparent, and all the trimming work that goes on in the window. However, if you start to increase the outline, that really start to become more defined. And that's essentially what ambient occlusion does. You can kind of argue that point too, but this becomes very useful when you're trying to define the faces on your rendering. So I like to put somewhere around 20 to 30% depending on my mood as well. And you can certainly utilize the depth of field effect. This is basically, if you increase this bar, puzzlingly, it reduces the amount of depth of field. So as you increase this bar, you become more out focused basically. And you can uncheck this and then just use this bar to change your focus point. So as you want to avoid focusing onto your background, again, going back to focusing on your project point, you want to do that so that everything in your background start to become sort of faded out. So I like using that to just kind of focus onto your project. Let me just back out a little further. So again, I can just change the focal point visually, and then yeah, everything else becomes sort of out focused or shallow depth of field if you're more used to the technical term. And obviously, another way to focus onto your project is to introduce a bit more vignette into your scene. So into the image tab, and then I can increase the vignette. So the outer edges of your screen becomes darker, therefore bringing more focus to your project. So with those sort of three practice, you really focus onto your object or project, your design in your scene. So those are extra little tips for renderings if you aren't used to some rendering practices. And another word of advice is to add a bit more imperfections in your scene. And here, actually, let me remove the depth of field for modeling purpose. So here, as I copy these planters, I have just kind of rotated them around and put them out of whack in terms of alignment. Same thing, I would attempt similar thing to these furnitures. So as these chairs take up the space, in order to add a bit more realism, nobody would line up all of these perfect. So the practice that we usually go through is actually mess them up a little bit. So put them out of alignment. That way it seems more realistic than everything being 3D modeled. It's a little thing, such a little thing, but sometimes that really just adds additional detail to your scene and composition. And lastly, because this was such a small project, by default inside of at least SketchUp, by default, your field of view is 35 degrees actually. And that doesn't really show much in your scene. You capture very little. So I start to increase the amount of field of view inside of SketchUp to begin with, just so that I have a bit more modeling screen real estate, but also inside of your visual settings, I can increase the field of view, and that's grayed out because I have synchronized view. But as I do that, I can increase the field of view that's available on your Enscape side. That way you start to capture more into your scene. And having a wide lens in the physical space for your DSLR, it could be quite pricey, but here it comes free. So we can go to questions and Q&A session here, Jeff.
Yes, we
Cover
want to
most of
thank
the content here.
Yeah, we want to thank everybody for submitting their questions. Gemma has been working mad in the background trying to answer as many as possible here, but if we can't get through, we're going to spend probably about 5 minutes here going over some questions. But if we can't get to it, we'll definitely respond back to you offline. So let me just go up here. So there was a number of questions about this, and I'll kind of combine a few of them. Somebody asked whether or not you yourself use more SketchUp or Revit, and I guess as an expansion on that, do you have any scene files that show the use of Revit with Enscape, or something that you could link people to?
Enscape themselves actually offer example Revit files. So if you go to their website, they have a page that's dedicated for providing example files. And there's one great example, but it is a bit heavier than what I would like to handle on a live webinar. So I didn't use that, but that's a great resource to check it out. You can test all sorts of different things. It looks beautiful.
Okay.
And to answer that question about Revit and SketchUp, I use 50-50, I would say. I spent most amount of daytime using Revit and doing BIM stuff. But when it comes to visualization, I tend to use SketchUp a bit more just because amount of freedom I have. So I would say about 50-50. And if you go to my channel, I cover more SketchUp stuff because it tends to be a bit more visualization content. But in a day-to-day making drawing process, I use Revit to do.
Okay. There's a question here asking whether or not you're able to change the material of a proxy.
If you change it inside of the file that's saved out, yes, you can change it. And I actually don't know if it is still the truth where I used to change it and then save it, and it doesn't directly change that is already active in the scene. But as long as you reload, yeah, it changes all the materials as you change inside of the proxy.
Okay. There's a question here asking about creating realistic curtains and fabrics in Enscape.
So you will rely on whatever the software that you're using to model the 3D. So that will be the tutorial on how to model curtain on SketchUp, or for that matter, Revit or ArchiCAD or Rhino. But I would advise if you're trying to make those type of difficult geometry, I would look at 3D Warehouse. There's a bunch of beautiful looking curtains that you can download and then implement into your scene.
Okay. Can you use a background HDRI image resize to fit the screenshot?
Yes, there is a way to do that on Enscape's side. Let me just quickly show. So on the rendering side in Atmosphere, you can change certain type of background image, and then you can also, there used to be an option to load the HDRI. I did a tutorial on it and they just kind of changed where the button is, so I'm not able to show for some reason. Yeah. But yeah, you're able to bring in HDRI is what I'm aware of.
Okay. This was towards the end of your presentation here when you're showing the sharing permission. Somebody had a question here whether or not you can share with permissions if the project is NDA.
For the web link, no, I don't think so. And I guess that's what they're referring to, the web link, the
Yeah, I
web
think so.
standalone. Yeah, no, not directly, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
It's a security over ambiguity thing.
Question here about whether or not Enscape models can be edited.
So I'm understanding that as a standalone. So no, you're not able to like render up a scene. Obviously you can screenshot, but you're not able to render up your scene nor edit the standalones that are out. So it's essentially a viewer.
Question here about when should somebody use an Enscape asset versus the native ones from a 3D modeling software?
So it is, which one is better? Is it what they're asking?
I guess just when to pick one over the other. Is there any advantage to using one versus the other?
I find it is better to use Enscape assets when possible. Obviously, your project has to be exclusive to Enscape in order to do that. Otherwise, again, same thing about having the sort of the replacement or the proxies that shows up on your scene. If it's a blob, I don't want that to not make sense for people who's not utilizing Enscape. So that's sort of the things to consider if you're just trying to use Enscape only. But when possible, you can also use something like 3D Warehouse to bring in. I'm more advocate of uses whatever you can to make the scene look as good as possible. Obviously, you have to do a bit more cleanup whenever you're bringing those foreign objects. But whenever I'm trying to put down trees, people, cars, really easy to bring in the Enscape stuff. But whenever there's specific type of furniture that I'm looking for, often Enscape doesn't have it. If that's the case, my first point would be 3D Warehouse to bring in some stuff or even model it myself or maybe modify.
Okay. So it's just we're going to do a couple more questions here because we're still getting a ton here, and I don't think we'll have a time to answer them all. But again, we will answer these as follow-ups after the webinar. Question here about whether ray tracing has much impact on rendering quality.
Yes, especially when you have a lot of reflective scenes. And I've actually questioned a more Enscape technical person to really understand myself too. So ray tracing currently is being utilized for more reflective surfaces on Enscape, and it really looks better if you have like a mirror or a lot of reflective materials on your scene. So for that, you do want to utilize RTX graphics card. But for most of the cases, I'm not having as many reflective surfaces, not as many lights in the scene that are producing complex renderings. So most cases, I don't use or I don't utilize ray tracing as heavily as some of those unique case scenario.
Okay, and I think this will be our last question here. So wondering whether you can go through how you're saving out your settings per project.
Oh, yes. I've actually missed out that process I intended to show. So I'm glad you asked. Thank you. So for example, the aerial scene, I have this specific, let me synchronize a view. So on the aerial scene, I have this preset of load preset, load from project, and I have two different settings that are saved. So for exterior setting, I just click on this one, okay that, and that is shown. Whereas if I go back to interior, then I can go to presets, load presets, and I can go to interior. So that interior preset has been loaded into your scene. And you can also, on the manage view, you can favoritize all of those views that you have so that you can quickly toggle inside of Enscape. There's a little bar that shows up as you favoritize certain type of views, and you can toggle in between. And then you can also dedicate those settings to the view, particular view. So as you flip them around, the lighting or the render settings kind of change. So my way of going between SketchUp scene is to hit page up and down. So that's a little tip there. So up to go to modeling view, to the aerial view, front exterior, and then interior, but that's just a SketchUp change. But if inside of Enscape, you can use the same short key of page up and down. So go to page down, and then I go to the aerial, close up, and then the exterior, and then it switches to interior.
I guess while we're on this will be the last question. How do you save a visual preset?
Visual preset. So that was pretty much how you do it. So if you go to visual settings and here under preset, this button here, save preset, and I can save to a project with a certain name. I already have these two, so I can do interior, or I can just say test for that scene. Or if you want to save it out as a separate file, you can do save to file, and then that will bring up, and then you can just save the settings so that you can use from other file as well. And the loading process is exactly the same. Either you take it from the project or load from file.
Excellent. Well, I think that is going to be the last question for the webinar. I really appreciate your talk today, Joseph. It was fantastic, and hopefully you'll be able to, everybody will be able to head over to your YouTube channel and check out some of your other work. And like I say, if everybody, if you got a couple more seconds here to type in your questions if you have any last ones, and we'll make sure to get those answered afterwards. So thank you again, and thanks for joining the webinar today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.